There are certain words a person carries for a long time before they ever allow them to exist outside their own heart. Not because they are dramatic, not because they are meant to hurt, but because once spoken, they change everything. And sometimes the hardest messages are the ones filled with the most love. If this were their last message to you, it wouldn't begin with blame. It wouldn't begin with anger. It wouldn't begin with regret wrapped in accusation. It would begin quietly, the way real emotions usually do. They would probably say your name first, not loudly, just softly, the way they say it in their thoughts when no one else is around. They would tell you that meeting you changed them in ways they didn't fully understand at the time, that from the very beginning something felt different, not explosive, not chaotic, but steady, grounded, safe, and that scared them more than they ever admitted. They would confess that they weren't always ready for the depth you offered, that your presence required honesty, and honesty requires courage. And sometimes they didn't have enough of it, not because they didn't care, but because caring that deeply felt overwhelming. If this were their last message, they wouldn't pretend everything was perfect. They would acknowledge the misunderstandings, the silences, the moments where both of you stood on opposite sides of the same feeling, but didn't know how to reach each other. They would admit that they should have spoken more clearly, that they should have shown up more fully, that fear disguised itself as patience, and hesitation disguised itself as timing. They would tell you that losing the ease between you was one of the quietest pains they've ever felt. Not loud heartbreak, not dramatic collapse, but a slow realization that something meaningful had slipped into distance. They would say that your silence changed them, that when you pulled back, even slightly, they felt it deeply, that your quiet was not cold, it was self-protection, and they understand that now in a way they didn't before. They would want you to know that you were never just someone to them. You were the person they thought about during ordinary moments, the person whose opinion mattered more than they showed, the person whose calm presence felt like home without ever needing to call it that. They would admit that they replay conversations in their mind, not to reopen wounds, but to understand where they could have been braver, where they could have chosen vulnerability instead of silence, where they could have said, "I care more than I'm showing." If this were truly their last message, they wouldn't try to hold you in place. They wouldn't ask you to wait. They wouldn't create promises they aren't certain they can fulfill. Instead, they would say something much harder. They would say, they hope you find a love that never makes you question your worth. They would say, they hope someone meets your steadiness with equal steadiness. They would say, they hope the next person understands how rare your patience is and never takes it for granted. And somewhere in between those selfless wishes, there would be a quiet truth. They wish they had been ready to be that person. They would tell you that loving you taught them something important, that real connection is not about intensity, but about presence. That love is not proven in grand gestures, but in consistency. That silence, when misused, can cost something irreplaceable. They would thank you, not casually, but deeply, for the way you saw them, for the way you stayed calm when things felt uncertain, for the way you didn't turn vulnerability into weakness. They would admit that you raised their standard for what connection should feel like. That after you, superficial interactions felt empty. That peace is harder to find than passion, and you gave them peace. And then, the part that would break your heart the most wouldn't be dramatic. It would be simple. They would say, "I never stopped caring," not in a way that demands action, not in a way that rewrites the past, just as truth. Because sometimes the deepest heartbreak isn't about hatred or betrayal. It's about two people who felt something real but didn't align at the right time. Two hearts that recognized each other but hesitated when courage was required. If this were their last message, it would not end with anger. It would end with softness, with gratitude, with the quiet acknowledgement that what you shared mattered, and that no matter where life takes both of you, a part of them will always respect the space you once held in their heart. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would simply be honest. And sometimes honesty is what breaks us, not because it is cruel, but because it is real. If they kept speaking, if this truly was the last time they were ever allowed to put their heart into words for you, it would get quieter, not louder. The dramatic parts would already be behind them. What would remain would be the raw, unfiltered truth they were never brave enough to say when it mattered most. They would tell you that they remembered the exact moment they realized you were becoming important to them. Not the first time they saw you, not the first conversation, but the first time they felt afraid of losing you. That was the moment everything shifted. Because caring in the beginning feels light, it feels exciting, it feels manageable. But the moment you realize someone's absence would hurt, that's when love stops being simple. They would admit that from that moment on, something inside them changed. They became more cautious, more aware, more guarded, not because they wanted distance, but because vulnerability terrified them. You were no longer just someone they enjoyed talking to. You became someone whose opinion mattered, someone whose silence felt heavy, someone whose mood could shift their entire day. And instead of leaning into that, they pulled back just enough to protect themselves. They would say, they wish they hadn't. They would tell you that you deserved clarity, not confusion. You deserved reassurance, not mixed signals. You deserved someone who didn't hesitate when it came to choosing you openly. They would confess that there were nights they almost reached out, typed the message, deleted it, rewrote it, stared at the screen, and then chose silence. Not because they didn't care, but because they overthought, because they feared saying the wrong thing, because they weren't sure if they still had the right to show up, and in that hesitation, time stretched, distance grew, silence hardened. If this were their last message, they would want you to understand something important. None of it was because you weren't enough. It was because they weren't ready to be seen fully, ready to commit without escape routes, ready to love without holding part of themselves back. They would tell you that your strength intimidated them sometimes, the way you could pull back when you felt something shift, the way you didn't beg for attention, the way you chose dignity over drama. It forced them to confront their own inconsistencies, and instead of stepping up immediately, they froze. They would admit that they underestimated how deeply your silence would affect them. When you became quieter, when your energy shifted, when your warmth became measured, they felt it. But by then, pride had already built walls, and walls are harder to tear down than to build. They would say that losing the natural flow between you hurt more than they ever expected. Not in a loud, explosive way, but in small, piercing moments. Hearing something funny and realizing you were the person they wanted to tell first. Experiencing something meaningful and missing your perspective. Feeling something heavy and knowing you were the one who would have understood without explanation. They would tell you that after you, they became more aware of what real connection feels like. And because of that, superficial interactions felt thinner. Conversations felt less grounded. Laughter felt lighter but emptier. You changed their understanding of intimacy. Not physical intimacy. Emotional intimacy. The kind that feels like safety. The kind that feels like home. And if this were truly their last message, they wouldn't try to fix anything at the end. They wouldn't try to rewrite history or promise future miracles. They would simply tell you the truth they carry quietly. They loved you in the only way they knew how at the time. Imperfectly, guardedly, but genuinely. They would say they are sorry, not in a dramatic, guilt-driven way, but in a humble one. Sorry for the moments you felt uncertain. Sorry for the times you questioned where you stood. Sorry for not matching your steadiness with equal courage. They would tell you that you taught them something invaluable, that love requires action, not assumption, that silence is not always strength, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak before it's too late. And then, with a softness that feels almost unbearable, they would say this: if life gives you a love that feels safe and chosen, don't hesitate the way I did. They would want you to be happy. not as a cliché, not as a performance, but truly happy, even if that happiness doesn't include them. And underneath that selfless wish would be a quiet ache, because part of them hoped they would have been the one to give you that certainty. This wouldn't be a message filled with chaos. It would be filled with truth. And truth, when spoken without defense, has a way of breaking the heart gently instead of violently. Not because it's cruel, but because it's honest. And sometimes the hardest thing to accept isn't that someone didn't care. It's realizing they cared deeply, but not bravely enough. If they kept going, if this truly was the last time they would ever open their heart to you without filters, there would be a moment where their voice would soften even more. Not because they are unsure, but because this is the part that costs them most to admit. They would tell you that they sometimes wonder what would have happened if they had chosen differently. Not in a way that traps them in the past, but in quiet, reflective moments when life slows down and honesty becomes unavoidable. They would think about the version of themselves who almost said more, who almost showed up more fully, who almost chose courage instead of caution. And they would realize how small decisions shaped a much larger distance. They would admit that they convinced themselves you would always be there, not because they thought you were weak, but because your patience felt endless, your understanding felt steady, your presence felt constant. They mistook your strength for permanence, and by the time they understood that even the strongest hearts withdraw when they feel unchosen, it was already too late. They would tell you that your silence was louder than any argument could have been. When you stopped explaining, when you stopped reaching, when you stopped asking for clarity, that was the moment reality settled in. You were no longer fighting for something they were hesitant to define. And that's when it hit them. You were protecting yourself. They would admit that seeing you choose yourself forced them to confront their own passivity. You didn't create drama. You didn't beg. You didn't chase. You adjusted. You recalibrated. You stepped back with dignity. And something about that broke them quietly, because they realized you were strong enough to walk away from confusion, and they weren't strong enough to stop you. If this were truly their last message, they would want you to understand that they saw your value. Maybe not loudly enough, maybe not soon enough, but they saw it. They saw how carefully you loved, how thoughtfully you communicated, how deeply you felt, how intentionally you showed up. They just didn't know how to mirror it at the time. They would confess that after you, they became more self-aware. They started noticing their own patterns. The way they retreat when emotions deepen, the way they delay difficult conversations, the way they convince themselves there is always more time. You were the mirror that revealed those truths, and losing you was the consequence that made them impossible to ignore. They would say that sometimes growth comes at the cost of something beautiful, and you were something beautiful. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. And real connections are rare. They would admit that they sometimes replay your last meaningful conversation in their head, not to reopen wounds, not to relive pain, but to understand where the turning point truly happened. They search for the exact sentence, the exact pause, the exact moment where both of you felt the shift. And the hardest part is knowing that it wasn't one big mistake. It was accumulation, small hesitations, small silences, small delays, until the space between you felt bigger than the effort to close it. If this is their final message, they would not try to win you back with words. They would not create urgency. They would not promise a future they can't guarantee. Instead, they would give you something more painful and more sincere. Accountability. They would say, I should have been clearer. They would say, I should have told you how much you mattered when you were still within reach. They would say, I thought I had more time, and then they would sit with that truth. Because sometimes the most heartbreaking realization is understanding that timing isn't just fate, it's choice. They would tell you that loving you changed their standards, that after experiencing emotional steadiness with you, chaos feels exhausting. That after knowing what it feels like to be understood without performance, shallow interactions feel hollow. You raised the bar for them, and they wish they had risen with it sooner. There would be a pause in their message here, a long one, because this is the part where pride fully disappears. They would say that they miss you, not in a desperate way, not in a dramatic way, but in ordinary moments, when something reminds them of your humor, when they need calm advice, when they want to share something small and realize you're no longer the first person they can send it to. It's in the small absences that the impact feels largest. They would admit that part of them hoped you would come back louder, that you would demand clarity, that you would force a confrontation. But you didn't. You chose peace. And that choice taught them something powerful. Love is not proven by how loudly someone fights to stay. Sometimes it's proven by how quietly someone walks away when they feel unseen. If this is their last message, they would not end it with hope for reconciliation. They would end it with respect. Respect for the role you played in their life. Respect for the growth you unintentionally sparked. Respect for the love you offered without manipulation. And then, with a softness that feels almost unbearable, they would say this: I will always be grateful that I got to experience you. Not possessively, not regretfully, but truthfully. Because even if the timing failed, even if courage arrived too late, even if paths no longer align, the connection was real. And sometimes what breaks the heart isn't betrayal. It's knowing something meaningful existed, and neither person handled it perfectly. But it mattered anyway. If they continued, if there was still more left in their chest that needed air before everything went quiet, this is where their voice would change. Not weaker, not uncertain, just softer, more stripped down. Because once you've admitted regret, once you've admitted fear, once you've admitted you weren't brave enough when it mattered, what remains is vulnerability without armor. They would tell you that the hardest part wasn't losing you in one dramatic moment. It was losing you slowly, feeling the shift, noticing the pauses get longer, watching conversations become careful instead of effortless, realizing that something once warm was now measured, and knowing they caused part of it. They would admit that they saw you trying at first. They saw the questions behind your calm tone. They saw the way you were still open, still patient, still hoping for clarity. And instead of meeting you in that space with the same openness, they stayed halfway. Half confessions, half effort, half courage. And love cannot survive on halves. They would say they didn't mean to give you uncertainty. They didn't wake up intending to create doubt in your heart. But intention doesn't erase impact, and the impact was real. They would tell you that one of the heaviest realizations they've carried is understanding that you started shrinking your needs because they weren't meeting them. You asked for less. You expected less. You adjusted your tone. You stopped pressing for answers, and instead of feeling relief, they felt something they couldn't name at the time. Now they know what it was. It was loss beginning. Because when someone who loves you starts asking for less, it's rarely because they need less. It's because they're preparing to walk away with dignity. They would confess that watching you emotionally step back hurt more than any argument would have. Arguments at least mean someone is fighting. Your calm withdrawal meant you were protecting yourself, and they didn't know how to fight that without confronting themselves. If this were truly the last message, they would want you to understand something deeply important. They never doubted your worth. They doubted themselves. They doubted whether they could sustain something that felt that steady. They doubted whether they could show up consistently. They doubted whether they were ready for the depth you carried so naturally. And instead of saying that honestly, they let confusion take the blame. They would tell you that sometimes people sabotage what they fear losing because it feels easier to control the ending than risk being fully seen. And looking back, they see traces of that in themselves. You were offering something real. And real love requires exposure. They weren't fully ready for exposure. They would admit that they learned something painful after you. Not everyone who loves deeply stays loudly. Some people leave quietly when they realize they are not being chosen clearly. And that's what you did. You didn't make a scene. You didn't throw accusations. You didn't demand apologies. You recalibrated. And your composure forced them to sit with their own silence. If this is their final message, they would say they wish they had understood sooner that love isn't about feeling strongly in private. It's about showing up publicly, clearly, intentionally. They felt strongly. They just didn't act strongly enough. They would tell you that they sometimes imagine a different version of events, a version where they responded quicker, spoke sooner, closed the distance before it widened, a version where they chose courage the first time doubt appeared in your eyes. But life doesn't rewind. It only teaches. And the lesson here was expensive. They would say that after you, they became more intentional with communication, more aware of how silence can bruise someone who is waiting for reassurance, more conscious of how delaying clarity can slowly erode trust. You changed them. Not because you tried to, not because you demanded it, but because loving you revealed parts of them that needed growth. They would admit that they missed the version of themselves that existed when things between you were easy, when laughter felt unfiltered, when the future felt open instead of uncertain. But they know that version required bravery they didn't fully step into. And here's the part that would hurt the most. They would say that even now, if you asked them whether what you had was real, they would answer without hesitation. Yes, it was real. It just wasn't handled with enough courage. And that distinction matters, because sometimes heartbreak isn't about a lack of love. It's about a lack of readiness. They would want you to walk away from this, if this truly is goodbye, not questioning whether you imagined the depth, not wondering whether you cared more, not doubting your intuition. You didn't imagine it. They felt it too. They just didn't rise to meet it fast enough. And so if this is the last thing they ever say to you, it wouldn't end with dramatic declarations or desperate pleas. It would end with truth. I'm sorry I wasn't braver when you were still within reach. And that's the kind of sentence that doesn't scream. It settles, heavy, quiet, final. Because sometimes what breaks the heart isn't betrayal. It's knowing two people felt something real, and timing, fear, and silence quietly unraveled it. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because neither of you were perfectly aligned when it mattered most.